This
Hopewell Valley.
conference will now be recorded.
Oh, thank you, Amelia. um, the Hopewell Museum, the Hopewell Valley Historical Society, the Pennington Borough Public Library, as well as the Hopewell Borough Public Library. So it has been a joint effort with the Mercer County Library System. Even though we're hosting the event, it has been brought in numerous entities around Hopewell and Mercer County. At this time, I would like to introduce our speaker. Doug, I don't know if you want to go ahead and share your slides before I introduce you. I'm very excited to have our this evening's speaker. Doug Dixon is an independent technology consultant and writer, now morphed into a history enthusiast. He is a board member for the Hopewell Museum and the Hopewell Valley Historical Society. Over the past few years, he's developed the Hopewell Valley History Project, which is working with many local contributors to collect and share digital copies of local historical materials, and now with over 400 documents and maps and 2,000 images. As a software technologist, Doug specializes in web technology and digital media. He's authored 4 books on digital media, published hundreds of featured articles, and presented over 100 seminars and talks. So without further ado, I pass it over to you, Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you much. And thanks everybody for tuning in. This is a virtual tour of Railroad Place in Hopewell, addressing the burning question, what are all those big industrial buildings doing down by the train tracks in Hopewell? Where did they come from? Who made them, created the businesses, ran the businesses, etc. So there's a whole bunch of stories that go along with this that we'll be looking at tonight. This talk will go on a little more than an hour, but I will desperately attempt not to drive into the gory detail, which is just totally fascinating to me, but we can live without it, I assume, tonight. And then there's plenty of time for questions, and the slides will hint at things you may want to question about, and I'll point out gaps as we go along as well. So let's begin. So first of all, what is this Hopewell Valley History Project? You heard a little bit about it from Anna. So it's a volunteer effort. It's been running for a couple years now to collect, digitize, and share freely online important historical materials, the kind of stuff that you would want to have at hand if you were doing research into buildings or towns or locations or people in the Hopewell Valley. So that's the whole point of the thing. And we've collected information materials from 10 plus local organizations, including the library, the museum, the historical society, as well as 60 plus individual contributors. And I'll be crediting a number of them as we go through the presentation. All this and more is online on the website. So please go visit there. The site's at the bottom of every page of the slides here. So there's in particular, this presentation will be there real soon now. And there are background briefs that I've been preparing over the past couple months on each of the buildings that I'm talking about tonight. So there's some 90 pages of material online, which you can chase down, which again, I will not go through all of them tonight. We also have a couple slideshows online, and we've worked with the Hopewell Museum to create videos about some of these buildings as well. So you're welcome to go visit that. So the site is hopewellhistoryproject.org. You can check updates on Facebook. And the not so subtle subtext of this presentation is that we're always open to looking for additional materials. So if you have documents, maps, images, or you know of people who do, please get in contact with us. We're happy to take them, we're happy to scan them, we're happy to share them. So thank you very much. So back to the burning question, what are all these buildings doing here? And the answer goes back to really one clear answer, the railroad, okay? So the top map here is Hopewell in 1860, And what you notice is a bunch of farms. This is a farming community with a bunch of large farms and farmhouses. And then down here in Hopewell, there's a little bit of development here where there's some houses really located around the Old School Baptist Church down here at the intersection. So that's Hopewell in the 1860s. The bottom map is Hopewell in 1875. Only 15 years later, and something clearly happened here. And what happened was the arrival of the two railroad lines. So the line that's currently in Hopewell and also through Pennington is the Delaware and Bound Brook, which is the top railroad track on this map. And the line at the bottom is the MNS, which has come and gone through Hopewell and Pennington. And this building here is the railroad station at the time of the MNS, because the MNS got here first. And that's the cause of a bunch of development in the top left of the map, because that's where the train station was. So you notice there's development west from Hopewell, and there's development east from Hopewell, starting with the Calvary Baptist Church and going on. So something happened. And what happened was the railroad driving growth in this town. And so that's a long story. That's the Frog War story, which you may have seen the presentation for Heritage Week. But to boil it all down, in the 1870s, two train lines came up from the Delaware through Pennington, through Hopewell, and headed north. And 1876 was the battle between the two. So in January 86 was the Frog War, which was the physical battle to cross these two lines. That was followed by a legal battle, and then followed by a business battle between the two lines. And the M&S decisively lost all three of those battles. And so it went bankrupt in 1879, and soon thereafter, the train tracks were ripped up and gone. Now in Pennington, the train tracks went up the two sides of Route 31, so they were far away from each other. But in Hopewell, as you just saw on the map, they were right next to each other. So this is a 1887 map, Fowler's map of Hopewell, which shows at the top the one remaining train track, the one that we have now, and then where the previous train track had been was ripped out. So along Model Avenue to the left of the train station is empty, and then all this area to the right on the map to the east is empty because there was a train track there. And so if you were a booster of Hopewell looking for bringing growth to the town, bringing jobs to the town, expanding markets for the town, this looks like a deliciously attractive industrial district. We could do something with this. So how do you do that? Well, today that's a government job. So the local government provides tax breaks and the state government provides EDA funding. And that is, for example, how Cooltronic came to Hopewell, as we'll talk about later. But in the 1890s, that's the job of the community to make that happen. So we'll talk about how that happened with each of these buildings. Some of these are stories of individuals or families. So J.B. Hills and Smith, which became Rockwell. But many of these are stories of business associations and business people and the people of the community and farmers coming together to create organizations, associations to encourage growth. And they had names like the Hopewell Improvement Association, the Hopewell Factory and Inducement Company, and you see the same names over and over again investing in these companies. So these people invested in the National Bank and were officers of the National Bank. They invested in the savings and loan. They invested in the water company, the power company, the telephone company, and also in these improvement associations, which bought land, built buildings, and worked very hard to help Hopewell grow. So that's the big picture of the story. And you notice on this map, by the way, on the left is the old train station area, but the new train station is here by the railroad bridge. And this is the area to the right on the map that we will be looking at in gory detail coming up. But one more slide as preparatory. This is what having a train line going through your town does to your town. It really facilitates business. It facilitates markets. So this is an incredible photo from 1881. And this is a promotional photo as part of a promotional poster for Reuben Savage that was very kindly provided by Stephen Cohen, who's a postcard collector who basically allowed us to copy his collection of Hopewell Valley images. And so Reuben Savage had a general store in Mount Rose, but he also had a dealership for Lister Brothers Fertilizer. And so this poster advertises the fact that on September 1st, 1881, he took delivery of 200 tons of fertilizer. And you can't do that without a railroad, obviously. So here we have a siding at the Hopewell station. We have 10 plus boxcars along here, and then each boxcar has a horse-drawn wagon in which they're offloading fertilizer. And then the building in the corner is on the left corner is his storage shed. So you can imagine trying to deliver 200 tons of fertilizer with horses and wagons. It's just crazy to try to do long distance deliveries that way. So the bottom left corner is Hopewell 15 years later, but we still have, it says here, R. Savage's Lister's Fertilizer Storehouse here in Hopewell. So if you wonder why you want to have a railroad, this is why you want to have a railroad for business. Okay. So on to the industrial district and the virtual tour. So this is a 1932 aerial image of this area of Hopewell. 32 is interesting because that was the year of the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. And therefore, the press was all over Hopewell taking lots of pictures, and we're very lucky to have them now. So what do we see here? Well, the double dash red line is the train track. The line's actually off the track. You can see the track below it, running across Hopewell. And the solid single line is approximately where Railroad Place is. But you notice this road is not well defined. This was an open industrial district. There wasn't a nice road and nice curbs and a nice park for the train station. This was open space where they were piling up stuff for their various purposes. And so the buildings we see here in the upper left is the train station, down the tracks is the freight house, across the street is the chocolate factory, the brick building, down from that is J.B. Hill's. These are all very familiar to us. They're still around today. Across from Hill's in the right corner is the tomato factory, again, very familiar to us today. In the bottom right is the beginning of the Rockwell Cooltronic complex we'll talk about in a bit. This is the first building that became the much larger complex. And then up in the middle center here, beyond the freight house, are two buildings that are no longer here today, but we have remnants of them. And so we can talk about them, we can see them in aerial images, and we can figure out what happened here. So just beyond the freight house, it's marked here as FCA. That building was not actually built till 1948, as you'll hear in a sec. And then the building next to it is a grain and feed building, which burnt down in 1977. The FCA building also burnt down, and both were because of arson in Hopewell, though different spates of arson in Hopewell, which is sort of sad. And then the two dashed diagonal lines are sidings that came off the main tracks into this industrial area. So one of them came diagonally towards the train station, and it ends at basically the driveway to the train station. And this appears to be a boxcar sitting there at the end of that siding. And the other siding came from about the same point, past the grain and feed, over to, but not all the way to, the tomato factory. And this ends in a raised trestle because the ground falls away here, but the train wants to come on a straight flat surface. So it comes on this raised trestle. And then this whole area here was JB Hill's lumber and coal yard. So to deliver coal, they just rolled the coal car down here and dumped it out into bins. So it made delivering coal really, really easy for JB Hill. So we'll be looking at these buildings based on this aerial as we go forward. Okay, so a little more about these sidings. So here's in the top, a photo from 1955. This is the train station, obviously, and then the big white building is the FCA building, which was not yet built in the earlier picture. And what do we see? We see two train tracks, two main tracks going off into the distance. We see a siding here parallel to the tracks that ends in a stand. And we see the two diagonal sidings coming in. So the one siding comes behind the freight house, behind the train station, and ends in a boxcar on the right side. And behind that is the chocolate factory. And then the other siding went over from the other side of the FCA into the distance to the tomato factory building. And this here is the smokestack for the tomato factory. And now you know why these buildings are on an angle to the street and on an angle to the train line. It's because they had these diagonal sidings coming through. So the map on the left shows the same things. And though these sidings have been ripped up and they're gone, there's no rails left, the remnant of the siding and the ends of the sidings are still here in Hopewell, amazingly enough. So the siding that ran to the tomato factory is this structure here, which we'll talk about in a bit, down there by the tomato factory. And the siding that ran to the train station ended about here. And this is the bumper, which was the end of that siding, which is still there in the park by the train station, which is sort of fun to have. So that's the context of this area. So now let's go talk about these buildings. So for each of these buildings, I'll have a title slide like this. In the bottom left is an aerial that orients you. We're talking about the FCA space in the bottom left right now. In the top left is a quick summary of what happened. And then on the right are typically then and now pictures of the scene. So the FCA building was built in 1948. It was destroyed by arson in the 1990s, replaced, and has had a couple different owners since. So let's talk about those here. Whoop, didn't mean to go there. So here's the FCA story. So the FCA stands for Farmers Co-op Association. This was a sort of regional Mercer County area co-op that operated from 1915 to 1978. It was based in Trenton. And in 1948, they opened the Hopewell store. And this was a farmers co-op that sold seed and equipment for farmers and ground their grain and all that kind of stuff. And this store operated along with several others till about 1970. And so I'll have some other stuff on these slides, like the article in the top right that talks about opening that store. The point I want to make with the images on this slide is to show what we've been able to do with this history project. Because a year ago, if you had come and asked for information about the FCA and asked for images of the FCA, we had nothing. We had no images of the FCA besides the aerials that I've shown you, and only some of those aerials. But because the history project was running and we were talking to people and people were looking up stuff, here's what we have. So in the bottom right, bottom left, excuse me, is a zoom in on a 1955 photo. Why do we have this photo? Because in 1955, a high school student got his first camera and he walked around Hopewell taking pictures. And he had a good eye, apparently. And he thought he was taking a picture of the Hopewell train station, but we're much more interested right now in the FCA building behind. So that white building is the FCA building, okay? And luckily he saved his film, and in the past year he's been sharing this and a whole bunch of other images with us, and they're all up on the site where you can see them today. So that's cool. The other type of images that we've been getting are basically family snapshots. So people taking pictures of people, and specifically Memorial Day parade, for example. So the family thinks they're taking a picture of the kids marching in the parade or the float that the family designed for the parade. But what we care about is the street and the buildings behind. And the photo on the right side with the two young ladies is a wonderful example of that. This is, again, a zoom in on a family snapshot taken in 1960. And the snapshot was taken because these two young ladies were going off to march in the Memorial Day parade. So they're in their uniforms, they have their white gloves, they're carrying the flags, and they're ready to go off. They're standing in the driveway on Lafayette Street, but in the background is the FCA building. This is the only photo that we know about showing the street side of the FCA building and showing the markings on that building at the time. And luckily, Peter Gantz has been going through family photos and kindly shared this and a bunch of other stuff with us. So hint, hint, if you have these kinds of pictures with interesting backgrounds, we'd like to know about them. The other kind of imagery we've been collecting is artwork, and the bottom right is an example. So a number of local artists painted and drew scenes around our towns. So we're collecting those because they capture a snapshot in town, in time. And this image here is from a book by Ranulph By called The Vanishing Depot. So he went up and down the East Coast painting and drawing the vanishing old historic train stations. Bless his heart. And this is the only image we have that shows the writing on the building. It says feed and seed there. So thanks to him, we have that. We don't have images, for example, of the insides of these buildings. We don't know what they looked like when they were in use as train stations. But By also did an image of the trainmaster's office in Hopewell. So we have that, and that's up on the site. It's just absolutely fascinating. So that's the end of that pitch. So what happened to the building? So the building closed, the FCA closed in the building in 1970. And then the next occupant was this company, Creative Classics, and they made hobby craft needlepoint kits. So you could make needlepoint looking things without actually doing needlepoint. This was very popular for a while. And they were there till 1991 when the building was destroyed by one of the major spates of arson in Hopewell. And that was the arson that also burned the Van Doren's lumberyard, if you remember that. And then sometime around 1997, they rebuilt the building to what you see in the bottom here, which is very much the same as, but not the FCA building. So it's the same form factor, basically the same size, the same shape, etc. So it's very reminiscent of what was there, but unfortunately it is not the original building. Since then, it's been a consignment gallery and it's currently a dance studio. Because if you want a big open space to dance in, what's more perfect than this building, right? So the next building is a little more complicated. So this is what we call the grain and feed building. You see it highlighted in the bottom left in the aerial. But this went through several generations of a coal storage area, hay press, and then this building. And it was also destroyed by arson in 1977. And then that land was empty till 2007 when the current fire dance studio was built there. So in the images here, and you'll see these again, in the bottom right is a 1972 aerial by Dick Sudlow, who has contributed amazingly to this site. And you see the freight shed, you see the FCA building in white, and you sort of see the grain and feed building behind that. And then in the 1890s, we see the same area, but from a different perspective. So here's the train tracks. Here's a horse on this side of the train tracks. Here's a boxcar with probably milk containers there piled up next to it. The white building is the freight house. The building in the distance is the tomato factory. And then this large two-story building is a hay press. So there was a hay press there at the time. And then there's a big open space which you can't see because of the perspective in this building behind the freight house, which is where the FCA went. So let's walk through that, starting in the top right. So in the top right in this Fowler map, and excuse me, this E&S map that you've seen before, you see a dotted line going back from what's now Broad Street, which is approximately now Hamilton Avenue, and there was a coal yard back there in 1875. By the Fowler map in 1887, the second map here, he drew the train station, the freight house, a siding, a building along the siding, and a trestle. He used a great deal of artistic license in his rendering here, so none of this is exact, so we're going to regard it as suggestive. You're welcome. But by 1890, we have a much more definitive view of this area. So we see the siding going off to the right, and this is now identified as D.L. Blackwell's business, where he sold hay, feed, and coal, and he had an open coal area back here associated with the siding. By 1902, in the overhead map here, we see this area is identified as a hay press, which is the photo we saw before. Here's the trestle, here's the canning factory right next to the trestle. And then over here, the Blackwell and Hill, now J.B. Hill Lumberyard, was built by 1902. So the photo on the far left is the scene we saw on the previous page from a slightly different angle. So we have the freight house and we have this hay press building. This hay press was horse powered. You brought your hay and it got pressed into bales using horsepower. So the timing in all this is in the list above. So it was a coal yard. D.L. Blackwell had his business here. Then there was this hay press. Then there was a fire around 1911. And by 1912, this area became the grain and feed building that we talked about before and you saw in the aerials. And in 1977, that was destroyed by arson as well. Now, the 1977 spate of arson was kids in Hopewell, and they caused a great deal of problems before it magically stopped. The later arson in the 90s was unfortunately a member of the fire department, and he caused havoc up and down the Hopewell Valley area, but was eventually caught as well. So what is the building now? So as I said, that area burnt, the building burnt down, the area was empty till 2007 when Francois Guillemot arrived. He's also known as Le Corbeau, the Raven or the Crow, depending on how you want to think about it. And he brought his business Fire Dance Studio from Princeton in 2007 and built this building. And when I mean built this building, he physically built this building. His business is custom artistic and ornamental metalwork. So he does metalwork for industrial clients, but he also does his own jewelry and sculptures and the like. So the blue area here is the front gallery of the building. And you're welcome to go visit there, call and make an appointment. He has a lot of his artwork and his jewelry is on display in there, which is just wonderful. And that gallery, he reports, is basically built on the foundation of the original building that was there. When he arrived also, the trestles, the original trestles were still on the property, and he tore them all down except these last three on the right. So these are the last 3 piers of the original trestle that ran down to here to deliver coal. And so he closed them in, and they are now display areas for his artwork. And then as a bonus, he actually left the train tracks. So that's why this roof goes up so high. So if you go here and look up, you can actually see the train tracks. And outside the building, he also has some really fun artwork, his artwork and also some other people's artwork. So this is an example of one of those there. So you can walk up the driveway and see that in front of the building. When he tore down all the other trestles, he ended up with a huge pile of stone. And so that's what he used in the base of this building. That's why it's all stone there. Those are the stones left over from the trestle. So we don't have the building anymore. We don't have the trestle anymore, but we do have the end of the trestle and the stonework from the trestle, which is really nice. If you want to see what trestle looked like, go over to Pennington by the Pennington train station. There are trestles still there as well. Okay. So now let's talk about the buildings that we do recognize along the street, and we'll come across the street to the chocolate factory. This was the home of 2 different businesses, which were chocolate factories, and then a couple others that we'll talk about. So the top picture is the building circa 1897. The bottom picture is the building today, and you can see it's very well preserved and has lasted more than a century quite well. Thank you very much. So these are some fun images about the chocolate side of this story. So there were 2 totally different companies in this building. One was Mead Sweets, which is that top photo, and the second was the Hopewell Chocolate Company, who had as their brand name Hopewell Dainties. And this, as you see in the picture, is a Hopewell Dainties box, kindly contributed by Doug Robbins, which is amazingly preserved, again, for a century-old box, printed on paper and cardboard, amazingly preserved. So it's fun to have that. And then the Porsche sign in the bottom left corner, I was contacted by a guy over the internet who had this sign and wondered about it, and then kindly shared his photos with us. So these photos are up on the website, so you can get a sense of what the signage for this business looked like. Okay. So the first business in this building was actually the Hopewell Shirt Factory. And this goes back to one of those industrial encouragement groups, in this case, the Hopewell Improvement Association. So Hopewell people got together, created an association, bought this land, built this building, and then leased it to a shirt factory. The shirt factory was here in 1892 and then operated till around 1903 when they moved out elsewhere. And the interesting thing about this is just think about the machinery required to run the shirt factory. So first of all, the factory, according to this article, when it opened, is heated by steam and lit by electricity. And what's in this factory, as the ad says at the top, 100 girls who are paid $6 to $9 a week. And so the top floor of this building, the second floor of this building, had 100 sewing machines and 100 operators running those machines. The first floor was offices and a very large cutting table. And then the basement was all the machinery to make that happen. So there was a boiler for the steam heating. There were separate steam engines to run all those 100 sewing machines. Then there was a separate dynamo to generate the electricity to light the building. And then there was coal storage for all that. So what they were able to build here and then run here is just really amazing. So the chocolate factory moved out in 1903, but luckily there was, the shirt factory moved out in 1903, but luckily there was another business ready to move in, and this was the Mead Sweet Company, the first of our chocolate companies. Mead Sweet Companies was founded in, you may have guessed, Mead. They moved to Hopewell. They operated for a year after renovating the building, and then they decided to move to Trenton, where they operated successfully till the mid 1930s. And their advertising explained this was the sweetest, cleanest, most wonderful candy factory where even the air is washed. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but they offered good wages in a clean, light, ladylike manner. And we're hiring 50 young ladies. See, the ad says girls, but then they say young ladies in the body copy. So Bell Mead Suites moved out. So now we have an empty building. And so what to do? Who's going to occupy that? Well, eventually this was occupied by the second chocolate company that we'll get to in a minute, but there was another company in between. And the only reason we know this is one oblique reference in a newspaper article, and that was the Fraley Vibrator Company. So this was the business of George Fraley, who got the patent application in the bottom left for a motorized vibrator that basically shakes your fingers. So the idea was a barber, for example, could give a massage without having to be trained in a massage, without killing his fingers doing a massage, because the machine would shake the fingers for you. So it appears Fraley was in the building around 1906. There's separate evidence that his company displayed an electrical show in Madison Square Garden in 1908, but he was gone by 1909. But there is a reference in the New York Times that his company leased the Randolph Hearst home at 28th and Lexington in Manhattan, which is hard to understand. And if somebody figures that out, I'd love to know about it. Okay. So just a little more on massagers, just so you understand the context here. Um, Barbers gave massages as a standard part of haircuts from the early 1900s through and past the mid 1900s as just a standard thing. So the top right is a quote from the Hopewell Herald, in 1909, that references Harry Cox, who was a longtime barber in Hopewell, and then his son Raymond Cox was also a longtime barber in Hopewell. So the idea was his up-to-date shop now has the Fraley vibrator for face and scalp massage to remove pimples, blackheads, and dandruff, and provide an active exhilaration that causes a pleasant, warm glow throughout the whole system. Isn't that wonderful? And the point of doing this with your fingers, as opposed to some kind of icky foreign material like plastic, was, as it says in the bottom, any other kind of vibrating movement other than the human hand is unnatural and unsanitary. Now you know. And just to make this point further, the photo, and here it is in real life, this is the Oster
English.
Stimulax massager, which
Just like
Bob
open
Witowski bought in 1960 when he came to Hopewell to be a barber after he left the Navy. And Bob is still running his shop, Mr. Haircut, over on Seminary Avenue. And this piece of equipment was available in various versions decades before 1960 when he bought it, and you can still buy a variant of this today. It's a big old motor that you stick your fingers through the pad and it shakes. And it's a really strong shaking. So I'm not sure I would want my brain being bounced around with that. But so that's the vibrator story. So, but we do call the building the chocolate factory, not the vibrator factory. Sorry about that. So let's talk about the chocolate business. So after Fraley left, the people of Hopewell decided, hey, let's create a chocolate company and we can run it in this building because it's got that Bell Mead experience in the building. So we'll just incorporate a business and run a chocolate factory, no problem. But the smart thing they did was they hired Clarabelle Shattuck. So Clarabelle worked for the Bell Mead Sweet Company in Trenton as a supervisor. She had 10 plus years of experience in the candy business. So they hired her away from Bell Mead to be their general manager. And so they operated in this building for 20 some years. Some of those years were good, some of them were bad. They did have to reorganize and go through one bankruptcy. But then in the 1920s, things got better and they built an addition. But then finally, after making it through the World War, they ran into the Great Depression and went bankrupt. And another chocolate company apparently was going to try to make a go of it in 1931, but we don't know anything about that. So that was the end of major manufacturing in this building, and it's been used for miscellaneous things ever since. So Rockwell apparently used it in 1950s. There was an organ instrument factory here. The basement apparently was used as a shooting range, but I don't have any more information. More recently, it's been a warehouse, a studio for artists, and then eventually it was converted into 3 separate residential units, which is what it's used for today. The fun thing is, if you look at the writing on the building and the photo on the right, the front says Hopewell Dainies and the side says Hopewell Chocolate Company, makers of Hopewell Dainies. And if you look on the building today, you can see Hopewell Chocolate Company, makers of Hopewell Dainies. So that writing, one way or another, has survived on the building today. So that's sort of fun to see, right? So that's the end of the chocolate factory. Now we come to the tomato factory. So we're making our way down the street here. This is an interesting story which needs a backstory, which we will get to in a second. But basically, this was a tomato canning factory for over 60 years in Hopewell, mainly through a Hopewell company, but then some other companies. And then the 2 photos, the one in the top right is from 1897, and you look at the bottom, the building is very much the same today, even though it's now an antique center. So let's talk about the tomato business. So these are some fun artifacts provided by Marianne Browning, who created the Antique Center in the building and is still around running it today. So you can get a sense of how they were doing private label branding for tomatoes. The bottom right is a crate from World War I, United States quartermaster shipping Hopewell Valley canning tomatoes. So let's talk about the canning business. So why canning factories? Why canning business? Why tomato canning? Well, tomatoes were a good crop, a good cash crop. They grew well in New Jersey, but the logistics of getting them to the market is somewhat messy. So you're a farmer, what do? You have a horse-drawn cart, because we're talking 1892 here, and you put your tomatoes in the cart and you ride over unimproved back dirt roads to Hopewell. And now you have a cart full of bruised tomatoes to sell in downtown Hopewell. And even if you sell them all at a reasonable profit, what are you going to do tomorrow? How is this going to work in large scale planting? And so the answer in Hopewell and also in Pennington and Titusville and multiple plants in Trenton and all over New Jersey and up and down the area was to have the local community come together and build canning factories for fruits and vegetables, and specifically tomatoes. So this actually is a wonderful book by Mary Sim called Commercial Canning in New Jersey. And she documents this whole story, all the different canning companies all around. And so, for example, here's a cart bringing tomatoes to one of the factories in New Jersey. And this is just New Jersey, right? So a lot of this canning going on. So how do you make a canning factory? How do you put together a business like this? So here's the timeline. We're in 1892, and the bottom right corner, you see a news article that in the beginning of March 1892, a bunch of people in Hopewell got together and said, yeah, we should probably create a canning factory. That's probably a good idea. We'll send some people out to look at other canning factories and figure out how to do this. So in early April, they got together again and they said, yeah, we're going to do this. They founded the company, they created the stock, they signed up 60 shareholders, farmers and business people. They raised the funding. They already had thought about where to site the factory. So they adjourned the meeting, went and looked at the site, came back and agreed to buy that site. and they hired an architect because they already knew what kind of building they wanted. They met in May and they had bids on building that building. They hired the builder and he went to work. In June, they were already installing the boiler and other equipment in the factory. They opened in August, and by the end of September, they had packed 200,000 cans, quart cans of tomatoes. Not bad for 6 months. I mean, it's just astounding. So think about the business and think of it in terms of numbers and logistics. So when do you can tomatoes? You can tomatoes when you have ripe tomatoes, which is picking season, and that's August and it's September. So you get 6 to 8 weeks of good tomatoes until the first frost comes, and that's the end of that. And so the local canning company, through the shareholders and other contracts, had a in an arbitrary year had about 100 acres of tomatoes under contract to deliver to the factory. The contract did specify that you had to have springs on your cart so the tomatoes weren't bruised too well. And they also specified that you needed to have Livingston tomatoes, specific seeds. And there's a whole nother backstory about this. And A.W. Livingston, who basically invented the tomato that we know today. It's a wonderful backstory. And if you look at the museum video about the tomato factory, you can learn some more about that as well. So do the math. So they're going to produce in a good year 200,000 quart cans of tomatoes in a season. So that's 6 to 8 weeks, 200,000 cans in 6 to 8 weeks. In a good day, they were packing 10,000 cans a day. So that's 10,000 empty cans in the door, 10,000 full cans out the door. And to fill those cans, they need tomatoes. You need 4 or 5 or more tomatoes to fill a can. So that's 50,000 tomatoes in the door a day. Just imagine the logistics of that. It's just astounding to think about. And how do you manufacture cans of tomatoes? Well, you start with a bunch of tomatoes, you skin them and then drop them in liquid so that they soften. Then through an automated, semi-automated factory line, you spit those tomatoes into cans and cook the cans and seal the cans. And off you go. So I skipped over that first step there. So the first step is, how do you peel 50,000 tomatoes a day? And the answer is women with knives. So for example, in one year, the factory employed 65 women, 40 of them peeling and 25 of them assisting with the packing process. And these peelers were stars, absolute stars. The newspaper talks about them in really laudatory terms. Because if you're moving 50,000 tomatoes a day and you have 40 to 50 peelers, they're peeling 1,000 tomatoes a day and continuously, very fast, all day, 10,000 cans a day. It's just amazing what these people did. Just extraordinary. So the first of these businesses was the Hopewell Valley Canning Company. It operated from 1892 to 1937. It only had 3 presidents through most of that time, and then it sold the business to another canning factory. So you see the picture in the bottom left with the staffers in the right side of that picture. And then the bottom right is an aerial identifying the parts of the factory. The fun thing about this factory, and I won't do the details, is you see in the newspaper article to the right, this was basically a public business. It was something of a Hopewell co-op, though it was a shareholder company. So they had annual shareholder meetings where they presented all the numbers, all the finances for the business. And the newspapers recorded this and reported them. So we have year after year, basically the full finances of the canning company through this period of time. So what they paid for the tomatoes coming in the door, what they charged for the cans of tomatoes going out the door, what they paid for capital improvements, what they paid their staff, et cetera, et cetera. It's just fascinating looking at all this. So in 1938, A few more canning companies took over the business. So I'll go through these really quickly. The first was Quarryville. So Mr. Carroll moved his factory from Quarryville, Pennsylvania to Hopewell, did well for a while, and then was wooed away by Middleburg, PA, because they built a factory for him. Then there was the Urban Food Company, which operated through World War II. And then finally, there was the Hopewell Sun Packing Company, which also did quite well here for a while. And then in 1950, it was all over. And the land and the building and the equipment was sold in receiver sales and sheriff's sales. Then in the 50s, the building was used by Reynold Dansbury. He was a supervisor at the Rockwell plant, and as his family reports, he did subcontract work for Rockwell in the evening in this building. So this is sort of fascinating, the history of this building. Then in 1962, Maurice and Marianne Browning bought the building, and by 64, they had opened the Antique Center here, which is still operating strong. In their spare time, they also started a bath accessory and linen business, which was called Maurice Browning Inc., and they sold in fine stores like Lord and Taylor. Because you got a big building, you might as well take advantage of it, right? So you look at this building, it looks sort of ramshackle. It doesn't look strong and sturdy like a brick building like we saw earlier with the chocolate factory. But go in and visit and look at the construction of this building and how sturdy it was built to support all that machinery and all that weight in this building. And as you can see, it's stood up well over time. Okay, so we have a couple other buildings, but the stories aren't anywhere near as complicated, so that'll be helpful. The first is JB Hill, so it's down in the corner where Railroad Place meets Hamilton Avenue. This is the story of a family, the JB Hill family, which operated this business from 1890 to 2005 through 3+ generations of Hills. So that the top picture on the right is the original area with 2 lumber storage sheds and an office. And that area was rebuilt in 1918, not because of arson, thank goodness. And so now we have the bottom building, which is Morehouse Engineering, which has been renovated when Morehouse took it over. So Hills was a long, more than a century running business. They had lots of fun ads in the newspaper. Somebody had a sense of humor in this company. But you can see they're a coal business, they're a farming business with feed and seeds and fertilizer, et cetera. And they're a lumber business and associated building supplies business. And then on the right, by the 50s, they were doing more retail things like paints and mowers and stuff like that. So the business starts with David Blackwell, DL Blackwell, as we saw on the top right in that in that building that became the Feed and Grain. By 1891, he had partnered with J.B. Hill and started a joint business selling lots of this kind of stuff. By 1897, they had built the lumberyard in the current location. And by 1904, Blackwell retired and the business went and ran thereafter as J.B. Hill's. David Blackwell then lived to age 104 and was celebrated around Hopewell as a character who just kept on going. At age 95, he was still mowing his lawn and walking to the post office every day. So quite a character. The J.B. Hill is Joseph Bloomfield Hill, who, as I said, took over the business in 1904. In 1918, the original structures, which you see on the left, were rebuilt as you see in the map on the right. So there were 2 lumber storage sheds, which are no longer parallel with them, and then the smaller L-shaped shed behind them. And then J.B. Hill, being one of those people who does lots of stuff, was also in his spare time at the same time president of the canning company and president of the Building of Loan Association, and also involved in several others of these organizations. So there's lots more we could say about these people. It's just fascinating. So I'll talk about hills briefly in terms of generations. The second generation hills were the sons, Hervey and Edward Hill, and we'll just say 1920s is about when they got involved. And the big change in 1934 was adding the fuel oil business. So in this aerial from the Hopewell Museum, you see the J.B. Hill complex, and then you see the white oil tank here. So the oil tank was on Hamilton Avenue here where it meets Railroad Place. So the clever engineering here was that this oil tank was raised in the air, and you can still see the berms along Hamilton Avenue where that was. So they were, if you wanted to fill your oil truck, you just pulled your truck here, ran a hose, and it was gravity fed into the truck. So that's a good deal, which still begs the question of how do you fill the oil tank? Well, for Hills, that was no problem because they already had a trestle over here where they were delivering coal. So the coal car would come here and dump the coal into bins, or you could roll up an oil car here, right? And then they ran, yes, they did, a pipe across above, hanging above the street and over into the oil tank. So they were able to gravity feed from the train to the oil tank by running a pipe on two poles across Railroad Place. So obviously you wouldn't be doing that today, but it was a clever engineering solution to a problem of not requiring pumps and special equipment, all that kind of stuff. So they ran the oil business to 1970 when they sold it to Valley Oil. The third generation of Hills came in, we'll say around 1940. At that point, it was J.B. Hill and Sons, plural, and that was J.B. Hill II and Arthur Wright, who married into the family. And by 1938, they were already focusing more on retail and displays in the store and that kind of thing. And then by 1970, they converted the front part of this building to a retail hardware store. And that's the point where they sold the fuel oil business. And then in 2005, J.B. Hill II closed the hardware store and sold the property to Morehouse Engineering, which is in there today and did these renovations that you can see. And the picture to the right is a photo kindly contributed by Sky Morehouse of what it looked like when he moved in. And you can clearly see the Century hardware sign on the building at that time. So last but not least is Rockwell. So this building complex on Hamilton Avenue, which grew significantly over time, is a sort of long, windy story that I will rush through. You're welcome. So it was the Smith business and had three different names that way. It was the Rockwell business and had several different names that way. And then it was the Cooltronic business. And we'll just sort of walk through this quickly to give you a sense of it. This picture here was the main entrance of the building facing out on Hamilton Avenue. And this is the little R for Rockwell. So this was a photo taken during the Rockwell era. So the story begins with one person, Hugh A. Smith, but it's actually sort of a family story you'll see in a bit. So in 1900, Hugh A. Smith arrived in Hopewell. He had a background in machinery and in clockwork, and he built a machine shop further up Somerset Street that we don't have any further record of, certainly don't have photos of. And he built mechanical novelties, spring wound toys, and that kind of stuff, and then quickly branched into general metal manufacturing, including meters and the like. And his business was called the Smith Novelty Company. By 1903, he was doing well enough to build the building you see in the bottom photo here. And this is across Somerset Street from where the current Rockwell building is in the parking lot that's there. So he built this in 1903. By 1914, he expanded this building to 3 stories and was employing 40-some people. So he was quite the entrepreneur. And then In 1915, they incorporated it as the H.A. Smith Manufacturing Company. And in 1927, they built their first facility, which was the first part of the Rockwell complex. So in the top right, we have a map view. What we see in yellow is that original factory that we saw in the previous picture across Somerset Street where the parking lot is now. And then in pink is the first H.A. Smith Manufacturing Company, which is the picture in the bottom right. A lot of this information and photos come from the Hopewell Museum, which have a great Rockwell collection. So you see this building, long building, running down Hamilton Avenue here, excuse me, running down Somerset Street and facing Hamilton Avenue here. So Smith was another one of these go-getter kind of guys, as you can obviously tell. He bought the building, which is now the Hopewell Museum, as his residence, and then later sold it to the museum for use as a museum. And he was also elected mayor in Hopewell twice by rather large margins. And then there's a deeper story there that I'm going to skip for time purposes. In 1929, Smith was bought by a company called the Pittsburgh Equitable Meter Company. And the president of that company was Colonel Willard Rockwell. So that's where that Rockwell name is going to come from. And he sent his brother, Herbert Rockwell, to Hopewell to be the superintendent of the Smith business. So by then they were 11,000 square foot, 50 employees. Then by 1935, they had this main entrance we saw before, and they built the annex shown in red here over towards Lafayette. So now we're up to 20,000 square feet and 100 employees, but they kept growing. So in 1945, the parent company renamed itself Rockwell, and this became the Hopewell division of Rockwell. And so there were several additions then. One you should see in the top photo, the red area is a Quonset hut kind of addition out the back. And then in the bottom photo is the big addition out towards Lafayette. So they were up to 100,000 square feet and 200 employees, at which point Rockwell consolidated its taxi meter operation in Hopewell. And many people just remember it that way. Then in 1973, Rockwell, the parent company, merged. They actually merged two different Rockwell companies and called it Rockwell International. And at that point, it was time to close the Hopewell plant because it was pathetically small by then, obviously. And interestingly enough, the acting general manager at that time was A. Merlin Smith, who was the grandson of H.A. Smith. So H.A. Smith started the company. His son, A.H. Smith, took over the company. And then later, A. Merlin Smith was the general manager when the company folded. Okay. So that's the story of the buildings down Railroad Avenue. Obviously, there's lots more to say, and I'm happy to answer questions. But first, let's finish up Rockwell with the Cooltronic story. So Cooltronic, luckily, was available to move into this huge building when Rockwell left. It's the business of Gerald Friedman, who started out in accounting and started Cooltronic. And then in 1975, with $400,000 New Jersey EDA, Economic Development Funding, moved from Princeton to the Rockwell building. And 1984, Cooltronic did the last major expansion and also updated their equipment with $2.5 million of funding. And so what you see here in the aerial view in the top right is all the different pieces that you can see if you look at this building from the outside. So in the top along Somerset is the original Smith building. This is the original entrance facing Hamilton. This is another piece behind that. This is the annex going out to the right that we saw earlier. This bottom left corner is the big piece that Rockwell put in. And then behind that is the part that Cooltronic cleaned up, which originally was Quonset huts and some other miscellaneous building. So Cooltronics was here till 1999 when they moved out. That was the end of manufacturing at this site. And since then, it's been used for miscellaneous office space and storage, but no major use like that. So here's your quiz. You're welcome. So on the right are all the things we've been talking about. So this is an aerial image from 1931 from a Mercer County planning document. So it's the same time period of the aerials that we've been looking at before. It's just a slightly different perspective looking east. So if you want to orient yourself in Hopewell, here's the train line on the left, obviously. And then the bottom is the railroad, is the bridge going over the railroad. So this area here, that rectangle, is the industrial district. You can sort of see Railroad Avenue going here, but you can see it's not a well-constructed road at the time. You can sort of see Hamilton Avenue, and that sort of frames the industrial district. And so we can see the things we've been talking about. So there's a train station, there's the freight house, there's the siding that comes this way, there's the open space that's the FCA building, there's the diagonal siding going up and to the right past the FCA building. That siding ends at the canning factory. Across the street is the chocolate factory and JB Hills. And diagonally across is the beginning of the Rockwell complex, the first H.A. Smith building. Across the street from that, in what's now the parking lot, is a bunch of buildings. And I don't know whether that's the original Smith buildings still or whether that was some kind of replacement. And then further up, you can see Somerset Street and the development that was done there. So that's the story in one beautiful image. What can I say? And as a bonus, here's a 1972 aerial that shows the same scene, and you've seen pieces of this going along. The big differences here are the addition of the FCA building and the Rockwell complex here, and then you see a lot of cars parked at the train station for the train service as well in 1972. This is, as I think I said before, an aerial that was done by Dick Sudlow. So again, that's the story. Thank you very much. And I didn't run too long, so let's open the floor to questions. Thank you
There
much,
have
Anna.
there have been some questions, Doug, that came in.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was about the arson, which you talked about and gave us some more information about that, which
Yep.
I appreciated that because I wanted to know about the arsons as well.
Yes. Sad story.
And I do have a lengthy, it's kind of a comment question. It has to deal with the train station, which obviously you talked about the train
Mm-hmm.
station and how that
Yep.
was part of the impetus for the whole industrial area there. Um, so this participant remembers it opening it up in 95 or 96, maybe. Is that right? And apparently one of the gentlemen who used to run or work there, he actually lived in the train station with his
Mm-hmm.
family. And so when they opened it up in 1995 or 96, she actually had the opportunity to go in and see what it looked like in there. And she said it was like
Yeah.
going into a time capsule, like the toys
Yeah.
were there that the
Mm-hmm.
kids played with and the newspapers from the 60s and the 40s. And she's wondering if anybody knows what happened to those materials. Are they at the museum? Is there some type of special exhibit somewhere?
Yeah.
I don't,
On the website, if you search for it, is a report that Michael Mills and his company wrote when the renovation of the train station was done. And so that has some pictures of the building, I think later than the questioner is describing,
okay.
and gives you some good insight into how the building was structured and where the walls were and what was going on in the cellar and that kind of stuff. But yeah, there doesn't seem to be much evidence of preserving even what it looked like in that
Hmm.
building and how it was divided up and how people sat on the seats, and that kind of stuff. So it's very frustrating to not have that. Very, very frustrating. Yeah, thank you.
And as a side note, she lived in the house on Model Avenue that used to be a schoolhouse. So
Oh yeah, sure.
just a
Yep, yep.
little nugget there.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things that came up from one of our participants is hearing more about Smith. It kind of sounds like it was a Hopewell scandal.
Scandal. Oh, okay.
Scandal.
Yeah. Oh, good. You gave me the chance to talk about that. Aren't you sweet? Thank you very much. So in the middle of this picture is the larger Smith story. So Smith was married, had 6 children. He was divorced by his wife. He was remarried in 1906, which is when he bought the house that became the Hopewell Museum. And then in 1916, he sued his wife for divorce. Now remember, she had divorced him earlier. He sued her for divorce and lost the case. Lost the case. He accused her of improprieties, and the judge said, no, she's a wonderful woman. She wouldn't have done that. And he was ordered to pay the court fees for that. So that was pretty much the end of H.A. Smith and Hopewell, unfortunately. But his family remained behind. So he turned the business over to his son, who stayed in Hopewell. And as you heard, his grandson was working at Rockwell in Hopewell. And so Smith moved to Belmar, New Jersey. Um, then there is a sad note, as you sort of hinted at in the newspaper. In 1929, the newspaper reported that H.A. Smith was missing from his home in Belmar and left a note telling his family not to come looking for him. He was going to be gone. And there's no follow-up to that in the newspaper anywhere, which is sort of frustrating, except he did live till 1944 and he did die in Belmar and he was running businesses in Belmar. So apparently he did come back. So thanks for letting me mention that.
Interesting. Well, that was one of our participants. You weren't off
Yes,
the hook to talk about it.
yes, thank you very
Um,
much. Yeah.
if anyone does have any other questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. I have entered websites to Doug's Hopewell
Hmm.
Valley History Project, so I do encourage you to go look at it. The documents there are,
Hmm.
it really is just a great archive of information, and to look at the programs that the Historical Society and the library is putting on. Um, Doug, it was such a great presentation, and I love how you're constructing the history with these images that you're finding and these
Yeah.
documents. And I can't wait to see what else you come up with, because I imagine you go down some historical rabbit holes with some of the information
Oh,
that you're
there's
finding.
lots more to find out, lots of open questions, and it's wonderful when people provide those hints of information that help me find things. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I
So
do
thank
have
you
one
much.
other question. Have
Hmm.
you been able to get more material since going virtual with programming? Have you been
Hmm.
able to reach out to more people to get more documentation and images?
Yeah, so Facebook's been very helpful with that. So people forward to their friends and that kind of thing. So I've had people contact me and send information on Facebook through Facebook connections. I don't even know where they live. They're not in Hopewell. They're somewhere else in the United States. But Peter Gantz, for example, is sending me information, and others have done the same. So it's just wonderful. It's very, very helpful.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I do
Hmm.
want to remind all the participants that we have videotaped the presentation tonight, and we will make that available to you. I will send the link out to those who registered, so you will be able to watch it again and go look back at some of the images. And if there are no other questions, I want to thank you so much, Doug. It was a wonderful presentation. I'm so happy that I got to be a part of it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks for sponsoring this.
And thank
Appreciate
you,
it.
everybody, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Ben.